Free will feels self-evident. You decide to move your hand and it moves. You choose a word and it appears in your mouth. But neuroscience and physics both suggest something deeply unsettling. By the time you think you've made a choice, your brain has already decided for you. The conscious self, it seems, is not the author of action, but its witness. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet placed electrodes on volunteers and asked them to move a finger whenever they wished. The results defied intuition. A burst of neural activity, called the readiness potential, appeared in the brain hundreds of milliseconds before participants reported making the conscious decision to act. The brain had started the movement long before you appeared to choose it. What we experience as will might be the afterimage of a decision already made. Physics sharpens the blade. At the quantum level, every particle's future is governed by probabilities, not intentions. Deterministic laws push forward from the past. Randomness intrudes from below. Nowhere in the equations does the concept of free choice appear. Whether atoms or thoughts, the system evolves from causes, not from an independent chooser. The self that feels sovereign may be a narrative created by the very processes it claims to command. Yet the paradox deepens. If all actions are preordained or random, how can you feel responsible? The sensation of agency, of directing one's path, remains vivid, undeniable. Something inside still insists, I am the one deciding. The mystery is not whether free will exists, but why the illusion of it is so perfectly convincing. Perhaps the real question is not whether you are free, but whether freedom itself is something consciousness invents to make sense of what has already occurred. When you decide to lift your arm, that decision feels instant and voluntary, but your neurons know before you do. Brain imaging studies have refined Libet's discovery. Researchers can now predict a person's choice up to 7 seconds before it reaches awareness. In that brief eternity between neural preparation and conscious realization, the mind is already set in motion. What you call deciding may simply be the moment you notice what your brain has already prepared to do. Every thought begins as electrical noise across billions of synapses. Patterns of firing emerge, compete, and stabilize into a single trajectory. An action, a word, a movement. Consciousness arrives late to the scene, narrating the outcome as if it had authored it. This is called the post-dictive model of volition. The brain performs, then the self explains. Free will, in this light, is not a force but a story, an elegant lie told by neurons to sustain a sense of coherence. Still, the illusion is necessary. Without it, meaning collapses. A brain that recognizes its own automation risks paralysis. It can observe itself acting but cannot believe in the purpose of its actions. So evolution may have built consciousness not to control behavior, but to justify it, to weave spontaneous neural events into a continuous narrative of me. We act first, explain later, and call the explanation will. This means the you that chooses exists milliseconds behind reality, surfing the wake of causes already in motion. Every decision you've ever made may have been chosen before the part of you that believes it is choosing was even aware of the question. What we name freedom might be the brain's most brilliant illusion, the trick of mistaking hindsight for control. The sense of being a singular self, the I behind every thought, is not a thing the brain finds, but something it builds. Neuroscience locates this construction in a network called the default mode network, active when the mind turns inward, remembering, imagining, evaluating. Within this loop, the brain stitches together fragments of memory, perception, and intention into the seamless fiction of an observer who persists through time. The self is not what experiences the world. It is what the world looks like when the brain tries to explain its own activity. When a decision occurs, countless neural subsystems, motor, emotional, cognitive, contribute signals that compete for dominance. Once a single path wins, the default mode network retroactively attributes the choice to a unified agent. It says, I did that, transforming a distributed process into a coherent story. This narrative self gives structure to chaos, allowing the organism to predict, plan, and survive. Yet it is also the source of the illusion of authorship. The I that claims control exists only because the brain keeps telling itself that control must exist. Patients with certain brain injuries reveal the mechanism in its rawest form. When one hemisphere is disconnected from the other, each side acts independently, yet each still insists it is in charge. One hand buttons the shirt while the other unbuttons it. Two wills in one body, each narrating the action as intentional. The split brain doesn't destroy free will, it multiplies it, exposing how fragile the illusion really is. So who or what is choosing? The self that claims ownership over thought might be no more than a commentary, a running translation of unconscious processes into the language of intention. You are not the one making the choice. You are the story that arises when the choice has already been made. If the brain already decides before you do, perhaps it's because the universe itself already has. Physics describes reality not as a flowing sequence of events, but as a static space-time block, a four-dimensional structure in which past, present, and future coexist. Every atom, every neuron, every flicker of thought is already inscribed in this geometric whole. What feels like choice is the subjective experience of moving through a pre-written landscape. The arrow of time points forward only because consciousness reads the universe line by line. In classical mechanics, this determinism was absolute. Given the position and momentum of every particle, the future unfolds with mathematical certainty. Even quantum mechanics, often invoked as a refuge for freedom, offers no true escape, only randomness. A quantum fluctuation can alter a neuron's firing, but randomness is not will. It replaces authorship with dice. The paradox deepens. Every decision is either determined or random, yet neither gives rise to genuine agency. From this view, free will becomes a linguistic mirage, a human attempt to describe a perception that physics does not recognize. The sensation of deciding arises because our brains integrate information over time. The body acts, the mind explains, and the explanation requires a storyteller who chose. The laws of nature don't require such a storyteller, only the story does. But this realization doesn't erase the feeling of choice, it intensifies it. Because even if the future is fixed, the experience of moving through it still feels like navigation. The map may be drawn, yet you still walk its path. Freedom, perhaps, is not the power to change the script, but the consciousness that reads it as if it could. Every instant you experience is already in the past. The brain takes roughly 200 milliseconds to assemble sensory data into a coherent now. By the time you become aware of a sound, a touch, or a decision, the underlying neural events have already occurred. Consciousness is not the first responder. It is the final witness. The mind doesn't record reality in real time. It edits it into existence after the fact. This delay is not a flaw, but a feature. The brain collects fragments from multiple sensory channels, light, sound, touch, and synchronizes them into a unified narrative. To do that, it must wait. It must hold reality briefly in suspension, blending what has just happened with what is still incoming. The result is the seamless illusion of a continuous present, a cinematic frame in which cause and effect appear perfectly aligned. What you call now is already a memory that feels current. In this stitched-together present, the sense of choice emerges. When the readiness potential builds in your motor cortex, your brain is preparing to act. A moment later, as that action begins, your consciousness updates the story. I decided to do this. But the decision had already been executed during the brain's silent interval of processing. The self claims ownership over a sequence it did not start, precisely because it perceives time in retrospect. Even free will, then, may be an artifact of temporal reconstruction. You feel yourself deciding because your mind must explain why the body moved. Agency is born in the gap between occurrence and awareness. It exists only in the delay that hides the true order of events. And yet, without that delay, experience would shatter into chaos. Perhaps consciousness sacrifices truth for continuity, illusion for meaning. To know you are late to your own life is one thing. To realize that lateness is what makes your life feel whole, that is the deeper paradox. The brain is not a passive receiver of reality, it is a prediction engine. Every moment it generates internal models of the world, forecasting what will happen next, and then compares those forecasts with incoming sensory data. When prediction and perception align, the brain experiences stability. When they diverge, it updates its model. This constant negotiation between expectation and evidence is what we call perception. You don't see the world as it is. You see what your brain expects it to be, corrected by surprise. Now extend that mechanism to action. Before you reach for a glass, the brain predicts the sensations of moving your arm, the sight of your hand approaching, the feel of contact. When those sensations match the prediction, the mind infers authorship. I caused this. The feeling of agency, then, is not the cause of movement. It is the brain's confirmation that its own prediction came true. Free will is not a command, but a recognition, the relief of seeing the world behave as expected. Experiments reveal this logic in reverse. When scientists subtly delay the sensory feedback of an action, say by half a second, participants report that the movement no longer feels voluntary. The predictive match fails, and agency vanishes. The will disappears not because the body stopped acting, but because the brain's forecast no longer fits the outcome. You lose control not in the muscles, but in the timeline of your expectations. This means every choice is a feedback loop. Prediction creates perception, and perception confirms prediction. We feel free because our models succeed. We feel trapped when they don't. Freedom, at its core, may be nothing more than the brain's confidence in its own accuracy, a self-fulfilling prophecy of control. And yet, beneath every correct prediction, the real event has already happened. The future you choose is the one your brain correctly guessed. You don't will reality, you synchronize with it. If our choices are predetermined, if every decision unfolds from neural and physical causes beyond awareness, then what becomes of morality, guilt, pride, forgiveness, punishment? These depend on the assumption that we could have done otherwise, yet the free will paradox insists we could not. Every impulse, every hesitation, every act of courage or cruelty arises from a causal chain stretching back before birth. The murderer and the saint share the same origin, physics in motion. Neuroscience confirms this disquieting symmetry. When people are told their actions are determined, their brains show reduced activation in regions linked to moral reasoning and empathy. They become more likely to cheat or act selfishly, perhaps because responsibility loses its anchor. But this response exposes the paradox itself. Even disbelief in free will changes behavior, which means the belief still shapes the system. The illusion, though false, remains evolutionarily useful. It motivates self-regulation and social cohesion. Reality may not require free will, but survival does. Consider the act of forgiveness. If you truly accept that others could not have acted differently, anger begins to dissolve. Accountability transforms into understanding. Yet that understanding only feels virtuous because it arises from the same illusion, one agent choosing to forgive another. Morality, like consciousness, may be a story the brain tells to preserve coherence between cause and meaning. Without the fiction of agency, the language of good and evil loses definition. Still, the paradox cuts both ways. If no one is free, then no one is truly guilty, but neither is anyone truly innocent. We are not authors of our actions, yet we live inside their consequences. The system sustains itself through the appearance of choice, not its reality. Perhaps that is why morality persists even in a deterministic universe, not because we are free, but because we must feel free to keep existing within it. Consciousness is often described as the stage on which experience unfolds, but what if it is the reflection, not the performance? Every neuron that fires, every signal that races through the cortex, contributes to the choreography of perception. Yet awareness itself may arise only when the brain begins to monitor that choreography, when it turns its attention inward and detects its own activity as something happening to me. The self, in this sense, is not the source of awareness. It is awareness observing its own mechanism. In cognitive science, this idea appears in higher-order thought theory. A mental state becomes conscious when the brain represents that state to itself. You don't merely feel hunger. You know that you feel hunger. You don't just act. You notice that you acted. This recursive loop creates the vivid sense of ownership that defines being alive. But recursion is costly. It introduces delay, interpretation, distortion. By the time awareness arises, the event has already occurred. Consciousness, therefore, cannot steer the process it observes. It can only narrate it. Yet that narration carries extraordinary power. The system that knows it is acting can learn, adapt, and plan. It can imagine futures and assign meaning to pasts. Consciousness transforms blind mechanism into subjective world. It makes a deterministic sequence feel like choice. The observer is trapped within causality, but through self-reflection, it experiences the illusion of transcendence. Modern neuroscience suggests that this looping structure may be the essence of the free will paradox itself. The brain predicts, acts, and then models its action from the outside, producing a meta-level awareness. I chose. What we call will is this recursive echo, consciousness watching itself unfold and mistaking that observation for control. But even an illusion, perfectly rendered, becomes indistinguishable from truth. The reflection does not move the dancer, yet without the mirror, there would be no dance to perceive. Perhaps consciousness exists precisely so that causality can look at itself and wonder. If determinism makes the future inevitable, and randomness makes it meaningless, where could freedom possibly exist? The answer may lie in the thin frontier between the two, in systems so complex that prediction collapses, yet causality still reigns. Chaos theory calls this the edge of unpredictability, where order and disorder coexist. A slight variation in initial conditions, a neuron firing earlier by a millisecond, a molecule vibrating differently, can cascade into entirely new outcomes. The universe remains lawful, but its laws amplify microscopic uncertainty into macroscopic difference. The question becomes, when the smallest events can transform destinies, does freedom reappear, or does chance merely disguise itself as will? The human brain is precisely such a chaotic system. Neurons interact in feedback loops of almost infinite complexity, sensitive to the tiniest fluctuations. Quantum noise, biochemical randomness, environmental context, all ripple through this network, shaping patterns that consciousness later interprets as decisions. From the outside, the system obeys physics. From within, the experience feels autonomous. Determinism and unpredictability merge into a single phenomenon, subjective freedom. Yet this freedom is fragile. It does not reside in control, but in sensitivity, in the way the self rides the turbulence of causes it cannot see. You are not the unmoved mover, but the moving pattern, the point where chaos becomes narrative. Your choices matter, because they instantiate one trajectory among countless possible ones, even if every trajectory follows from prior states. The feeling of decision is the brain's recognition of this branching, the instant it senses the universe diverging through itself. Seen from eternity, all paths exist. Seen from consciousness, one unfolds. The paradox is that both are true. You cannot alter the laws, yet your awareness is the place where the laws reveal their infinite possibilities. Perhaps freedom is not the power to choose differently, but to witness how difference emerges at all. Every morning you wake as the same person, or so it seems. Memories, preferences, and habits form a seamless thread across time, binding billions of neural firings into the identity called you. But neuroscience reveals that this continuity is an illusion continuously rebuilt. The brain does not store a self. It reconstructs one each moment from fragments of memory, emotion, and prediction. You are not a constant entity moving through time. You are the process that keeps reassembling its own story quickly enough to appear whole. This reconstruction depends on one crucial assumption, that the observer and the chooser are the same. The narrative self, the one that says, "I did this," is what stitches perception and memory into coherence. If consciousness were to realize it only observes, not decides, the entire structure of identity would disintegrate. Without the belief in agency, there is no thread connecting past intention to present outcome, no stable I that endures. The illusion of free will is therefore not just a philosophical mistake, it is the scaffolding of personal existence. Memory plays the starring role. Each recollection is not a recording but a recreation, subtly altered to match the story you believe about yourself. When the mind reviews its past, it retrofits intention into every act, assigning motives where there were none, weaving patterns through randomness. This self-editing is not deceit, it is survival. The brain needs to interpret its behavior as purposeful so that the next prediction of reality remains coherent. The fiction of will stabilizes the self that believes it acts. Even emotion reinforces this loop. Pride, regret, hope, all depend on agency. The feeling of regret, for example, arises only if you think you could have done otherwise. Remove that belief, and emotion flattens into mere observation. Without free will, joy loses triumph and guilt loses redemption. The human drama collapses into physics, and yet that drama is precisely what consciousness evolved to preserve. The universe does not require an author, but experience does. To remain a self, you must keep mistaking observation for choice. The observer is not free, but without its illusion of freedom, there would be no observer at all. Every paradox eventually turns inside out. The more science dissolves the notion of free will, the more it exposes a deeper coherence, one in which the illusion itself becomes essential. Consciousness, physics, causality, and chaos are not separate domains. They are facets of a single recursive structure, the universe observing its own unfolding through sentient form. What you call your awareness is the cosmos looking inward, modeling itself as choice. At the microscopic level, quantum mechanics reveals that observation is not passive. Measurement changes what is measured. potentialities collapse into outcomes. Yet the observer in quantum theory has no defined boundary. It could be a particle detector, a neuron, or an entire brain. The act of observation creates a difference in the universe, a transition from uncertainty to experience. Now extend that logic. The human mind, born of physical laws, becomes a higher-order observer capable of reflecting on its own participation. Free will may not control the system, but it completes it. Neuroscience, too, begins to mirror cosmology. The brain's predictive loops resemble the feedback equations that govern the universe's evolution. Both seek to minimize uncertainty, to turn possibility into pattern. The illusion of agency might therefore be the universe's local strategy for maintaining coherence, its way of stabilizing the turbulence of existence through self-representation. When you believe you choose, you anchor meaning within causality itself. You give direction to entropy, narrative to noise. Determinism, then, does not erase freedom. It redefines it. The self is not an independent pilot steering reality, but the conscious interface through which reality experiences its own motion. You are not outside the laws. You are their reflection. The sense of agency is how the universe feels from the inside when it becomes aware of what it's doing. Perhaps this is the hidden symmetry of the free will paradox. The illusion that separates you from the cosmos is the very mechanism through which the cosmos becomes conscious of its unity. Without the dream of freedom, the universe would never know it was bound. You began this journey believing you were the one who decides. You end it seeing that decisions unfold through you. Yet what has changed is not your power, but your understanding of it. The free will paradox does not strip away agency. It reveals where it truly resides. Freedom was never about escaping causality. It was about awakening within it. Every neuron that fires, every breath, every thought, every desire, each follows the laws of physics perfectly. But consciousness transforms those laws into meaning. The experience of I choose is how the deterministic universe becomes personal. Even if every future is fixed, your awareness of that unfolding remains unique. The film cannot change its frames, but only within the projection of time can it feel them moving. What you call will is that movement, the light of attention sliding across what already exists. If the self is an illusion, it is one that creates reality's most astonishing property, reflection. Through the illusion of choosing, the universe sees itself not as machinery, but as life. Each mind is a mirror that makes the infinite comprehensible, turning blind law into lived moment. The paradox, then, is not that you lack freedom. It's that freedom could only exist as something felt, never proven. So you keep deciding. You keep living as though you could have done otherwise. Because in every sense that matters, you do. The wave cannot step outside the ocean, but it can still shape its own crest. Perhaps that is what consciousness truly is. The universe noticing itself long enough to imagine it was free. Write in the comments, I still exist in the version that observes.